Chapter 1, which treats of the character and pursuits of the famous gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. In a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not long since one of those gentlemen that keeps a lance in the lance rack, an old buckler, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing, a nola of rather more beef than mutton, a salad on most nights, scraps on Saturdays, lentils on Fridays, and a pigeon or so extra on Sundays, made away with 3/4 of his income. The rest of it went in a doublet of fine cloth and velvet breeches and shoes to match for holidays, while on weekdays he made a brave figure in his best homespun. He had in his house a housekeeper past 40, a niece under 20, and a lad for the field and marketplace who used to saddle the hack as well as handle the billhook. The age of this gentleman of ours was bordering on 50. He was of a hardy habit, spare, gaunt-featured, a very early riser, and a great sportsman. They will have it, his surname was Quixada or Quisada, for here there is some difference of opinion among the authors who write on the subject, although for some reasonable conjectures it seems plain that he was called Quezana. This, however, is of but little importance to our tale. It will be enough not to stray a hair's breadth from the truth in the telling of it. You must know, then, that the above-named gentleman, whenever he was at leisure, which was mostly all the year round, gave himself up to reading books of chivalry with such ardor and avidity that he almost entirely neglected the pursuits of his field sports, and even the management of his property. And to such a pitch did his eagerness and infatuation go, that he sold many an acre of tillage land to buy books of chivalry to read, and brought home as many of them as he could get. But of all there were, none he liked so well as those of the famous Feliciano de Silva's composition, for their lucidity of style and complicated receipts were as pearls in his sight, particularly when in his reading he came upon courtships and cartels, where he often found passages like, "The reason of the unreason with which my reason is afflicted, so weakens my reason that with reason I murmur at your beauty." Or again, "The high heavens, that of your divinity, divinely fortify you with the stars, render you deserving of the desert your greatness deserves." Over conceits of this sort, the poor gentleman lost his wits, and used to lie awake striving to understand them and worm the meaning out of them, what Aristotle himself could not have made out or extracted had he come to life again for that special purpose. He was not at all easy about the wounds which Don Belianis gave and took, because it seemed to him that, great as were the surgeons who had cured him, he must have had his face and body covered all over with seams and scars. He commended, however, the author's way of ending his book with the promise of that interminable adventure, and many a time was he tempted to take up his pen and finish it properly, as is there proposed, which no doubt he would have done, and made a successful piece of work of it too, had not greater and more absorbing thoughts prevented him. Many an argument did he have with the curate of his village, a learned man and a graduate of Siguenza, as to which had been the better knight, Palmerin of England or Amadis of Gaul. Master Nicholas, the village barber, however, used to say that neither of them came up to the Knight of Phoebus, and that, if there was any that could compare with him, it was Don Galaor, the brother of Amadis of Gaul, because he had a spirit that was equal to every occasion, and was no finikin knight, nor lacked remorse like his brother, nor in the matter of valor was he not a whit behind him. In short, he became so absorbed in his books that he spent his nights from sunset to sunrise, and his days from dawn to dark, poring over them. And what with little sleep and much reading, his brains got so dry that he lost his wits. His fancy grew full of what he used to read about in his books: enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, agonies, and all sorts of impossible nonsense. And it so possessed his mind that the whole fabric of invention and fancy he read of was true, that to him no history in the world had more reality in it. He used to say the Cid Ru-Diaz was a very good knight, but that he was not to be compared with the Knight of the Burning Sword, who with one backstroke cut in half two fierce and monstrous giants. He thought more of Bernardo del Carpio, because at Roncesvalles he slew Roland in spite of enchantments, availing himself of the artifice of Hercules when he strangled Antaeus, the son of Terra, in his arms. His fancy grew full of what he used to read about in his books: enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, agonies, and all sorts of impossible nonsense. And it so possessed his mind that the whole fabric of invention and fancy he read of was true, that to him no history in the world had more reality in it. He used to say the Cid Ru-Diaz was a very good knight, but that he was not to be compared with the Knight of the Burning Sword, who with one backstroke cut in half two fierce and monstrous giants. He thought more of Bernardo del Carpio, because at Roncesvalles he slew Roland, in spite of enchantments, availing himself of the artifice of Hercules when he strangled Antaeus, the son of Terra, in his arms. He approved highly of the giant Morgante, because although the giant breed, which is always arrogant and ill-conditioned, he alone was affable and well-bred. But above all, he admired Reinaldo of Montalban, especially when he saw him sallying forth from his castle and robbing everyone he met, and when beyond the seas he stole that image of Mahomet which, as his history says, was entirely of gold. To have a bout of kicking at that traitor of a Ganleon, he would have given his housekeeper and his niece into the bargain. In short, his wits being quite gone, he hit upon the strangest notion that ever madman in this world hit upon, and that was that he fancied it was right and requisite, as well for the support of his own honor, as for the service of his country, that he should make a knight-errant of himself, roaming the world over in full armor and on horseback in quest of adventures, and putting in practice himself all that he had read of as being the usual practices of knights-errant, righting every kind of wrong, and exposing himself to peril and danger, from which, in the issue, he was to reap eternal renown and fame. Already the poor man saw himself crowned, by the might of his arm, Emperor of Trebizond, at least. And so, led away by the intense enjoyment he found in these pleasant fancies, he set himself forthwith to put his scheme into execution. The first thing he did was to clean up some armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather, and had been for ages lying forgotten in a corner, eaten with rust and covered with mildew. He scoured and polished it as best he could, but he perceived one great defect in it. It had no closed helmet, nothing but a simple morion. This deficiency, however, his ingenuity supplied, for he contrived a kind of half-helmet of pasteboard, which fitted onto the morion, looked like a whole one. It is true that, in order to see if it was strong and fit to stand a cut, he drew his sword and gave it a couple of slashes, the first of which undid in an instant what had taken him a week to do. The ease with which he had knocked it to pieces disconcerted him somewhat, and to guard against that danger he set to work again, fixing bars of iron on the inside, until he was satisfied with its strength, and then, not caring to try any more experiments with it, he passed it and adopted it as the helmet of the most perfect construction. He next proceeded to inspect his hack, which, with more quartos than a real, and more blemishes than the steed of Gonala, that tantum pellus et ossa fiut, surpassed in his eyes the Bucephalus of Alexander or the Babaika of the Cid. 4 days were spent in thinking what name to give him, because, as he said to himself, it was not right that a horse belonging to a knight so famous, and one with such merits of his own, should be without some distinctive name. And he strove to adapt it so as to indicate what he had been before belonging to a knight-errant, and what he then was. For it was only reasonable that, his master taking a new character, he should take a new name, and that it should be a distinguished and full-sounding one, befitting the new order and calling he was about to follow. And so, after having exposed, struck out, rejected, added to, unmade, and remade a multitude of names out of his memory and fancy, he decided upon calling him Roncinante, a name to his thinking, lofty, sonorous, and significant of his condition as a hack before he became what he now was, the first and foremost of all the hacks in the world. Having got a name for his horse so much to his taste, he was anxious to get one for himself, and he was 8 days more pondering over this point, till at last he made up his mind to call himself Don Quixote, whence, as has been already said, the authors of this veracious history have inferred that his name must have been beyond a doubt Quijada, not Quisada, as others would have it. Recollecting, however, that the valiant Amadis was not content to call himself curtly Amadis and nothing more, but added the name of his kingdom and country to make it famous, and called himself Amadis of Gaul. He, like a good knight, resolved to add on the name of his, and to style himself Don Quixote of La Mancha, whereby he considered he described accurately his origin and country, and did honor to it in taking his surname from it. So then, his armor being furbished, his morion turned into a helmet, his hack christened, and he himself confirmed, he came to the conclusion that nothing more was needed now but to look out for a lady to be in love with. For a knight-errant without love was like a tree without leaves or fruit, or a body without a soul. As he said to himself, if from my sins, or by my good fortune, I come across some giant hereabouts, a common occurrence with knight-errants, and overthrow him in one onslaught, or cleave him asunder to the waist, or in short, vanquish and subdue him, will it not be well to have someone I may send him to as a present, that he may come in and fall on his knees before my sweet lady, and in a humble submissive voice say, I am the giant Caraculiambro, lord of the island of Malindrania, vanquished in single combat by the never sufficiently extolled knight Don Quixote of La Mancha, who has commanded me to present myself before your grace, that your highness dispose of me at your pleasure. Oh, how our good gentleman enjoyed the delivery of this speech, especially when he had thought of someone to call his lady. There was, so the story goes, in a village near his own, a very good-looking farm girl, with whom he had been at one time in love, though, so far as is known, she never knew it, nor gave a thought to the matter. Her name was Aldonza Lorenzo, and upon her he thought fit to confer the lady of his thoughts, and after some search for a name, which should not be out of harmony with her own, and should suggest and indicate that of a princess and great lady, he decided upon calling her Dulcinea del Toboso, she being of El Toboso, a name to his mind, musical, uncommon, and significant, like all those he had already bestowed upon himself and the things belonging to him. Chapter 2, which treats of the first sally the ingenious Don Quixote made from home. These preliminaries settled, he did not care to put off any longer the execution of his design, urged on to it by the thought of all the world was losing by his delay, seeing what wrongs he intended to right, grievances to redress, injustices to repair, abuses to remove, and duties to discharge. So without giving notice of his intention to anyone, and without anybody seeing him, one morning before the dawning of the day, which was one of the hottest of the month of July, he donned his suit of armor, mounted Rocinante with his patched-up helmet on, braced his buckler, took his lance, and by the back door of the yard, sallied forth upon the plain in the highest contentment and satisfaction at seeing with what ease he had made a beginning with his grand purpose. But scarcely did he find himself upon the open plain when a terrible thought struck him, one all, but enough to make him abandon the enterprise at the very outset. It occurred to him that he had not been dubbed a knight, and that according to the law of chivalry, he neither could nor ought to bear arms against any knight, and that even if he had been, still he ought, as a novice knight, to wear white armor without a device upon the shield, until by his proudness he had earned one. These reflections made him waver in his purpose, but his craze being stronger than any reasoning, he made up his mind to have himself dubbed a knight by the first one he came across, following the example of others in the same case, as he had read in the books that brought him to this pass. As for the white armor, he resolved on the first opportunity to scour his until it was whiter than an ermine, and so comforting himself, he pursued his way, taking that which his horse chose, for in this, he believed, lay the essence of adventures. Thus setting out, our new-fledged adventurer paced along, talking to himself and saying, "Who knows, but that in time to come, when the veracious history of my famous deeds is made known, the sage who writes it, when he has to set forth my first sally in the early morning, will do it after this fashion. Scarce had the rubicund Apollo spread o'er the face of the broad spacious earth the golden threads of his bright hair. Scarce had the little birds of painted plumage attuned their notes to hail with dulcet and mellifluous harmony the coming of the rosy dawn, that deserting the soft couch of her jealous spouse, was appearing mortals at the gate and balconies of the Malchigan horizon, when the renowned knight, Don Quixote of La Mancha, quitting the lazy down, mounted his celebrated steed Rocinante, and began to traverse the ancient and famous Campo de Montiel, which in fact he was actually traversing. Happy the age, happy the time, he continued, in which shall be made known my deeds of fame, worthy to be molded in brass, carved in marble, limed in pictures, for a memorial forever. And you, O sage magician, whoever you are, to whom it shall fall to be the chronicler of this wondrous history, forget not, I entreat you, my good Rocinante, the constant companion of my ways and wanderings." Presently he broke out again, as if he were love-stricken in earnest. "O Princess Dulcinea, lady of this captive heart, a grievous wrong have you done me to drive me forth with scorn, and with inexorable obduracy banish me from the presence of your beauty. O lady, deign to hold in remembrance this heart, your vassal, that thus in anguish pines for love of you." So he went on stringing together these and other absurdities, all in the style of those his books had taught him, imitating their language as well as he could. And all the while he rode so slowly, and the sun mounted so rapidly, and with such fervor, that it was enough to melt his brains, if he had any. Nearly all day he traveled without anything remarkable happening to him, at which he was in despair, for he was anxious to encounter someone at once, upon whom to try the might of his strong arm. Writers there are who say that the first adventure he met with was that of Puerto Lapis. Others say it was that of the windmills. But what I have ascertained on this point, and what I have found written in the annals of La Mancha, is that he was on the road all day, and towards nightfall his hack and he found themselves dead tired and hungry, when looking all around to see if he could discover any castle or shepherd's shanty where he might refresh himself and relieve his sore wants, he perceived, not far out of his road, an inn, which was as welcome as a star guiding him to the portals, if not the palaces, of his redemption. And quickening his pace, he reached it just as night was setting in. At the door were standing two young women, girls of the district, as they call them, on their way to Seville with some carriers who had chanced to halt that night at the inn. And as happened what might to our adventurer, everything he saw or imaged seemed to him to be and to happen after the fashion of what he read of. The moment he saw the inn, he pictured it to himself as a castle with its 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, not forgetting the drawbridge and moat, and all the belongings usually ascribed to castles of that sort. To this inn, which to him seemed a castle, he advanced, and at a short distance from it he checked Rocinante, hoping that some dwarf would show himself upon the battlements, and by sound of trumpet give notice that a knight was approaching the castle. But seeing that they were slow about it, and that Rocinante was in a hurry to reach the stable, he made for the inn door, and perceived the 2 gay damsels who were standing there, and who seemed to him to be 2 fair maidens or lovely ladies taking their ease at the castle gate. At this moment it so happened that a swineherd, who was going through the stubbles collecting a drove of pigs, for without any apology, that is what they are called, gave a blast of his horn to bring them together. And forthwith it seemed to Don Quixote to be what he was expecting, the signal of some dwarf announcing his arrival. And so with prodigious satisfaction he rode up to the inn and to the ladies, who seeing a man of this sort approaching in full armor and with lance and buckler, were turning in dismay into the inn. When Don Quixote, guessing their fear by their flight, raising his pasteboard visor, disclosed his dry dusty visage, and with courteous bearing and gentle voice addressed them. Your ladyships need not fly or fear any rudeness, for that it belongs not to the order of knighthood which I profess to offer to anyone, much less to high-born maidens as your appearance proclaims you to be. The girls were looking at him and straining their eyes to make out the features which the clumsy visor obscured. But when they heard themselves called maidens, a thing so much out of their line, they could not restrain their laughter, which made Don Quixote wax indignant and say, "Modesty becomes the fair, and moreover, laughter that has little cause is great silliness. This, however, I say not to pain or anger you, for my desire is none other than to serve you." The incomprehensible language and the unpromising looks of our cavalier only increased the lady's laughter, and that increased his irritation, and matters might have gone further if at that moment the landlord had not come out, who, being a very fat man, was a very peaceful one. He, seeing this grotesque figure clad in armor that did not match any more than his saddle, bridle, lance, buckler, or corselet, was not at all disposed to join the damsels in their manifestations of amusement. But in truth, standing in awe of such a complicated armament, he thought it best to speak him fairly. So he said, "Señor Caballero, if your worship wants lodging, batting the bed, for there is not one in the inn, there is plenty of everything else here." Observing the respectful bearing of the alcalde of the fortress, for so innkeeper and inn seemed in his eyes, made answer, "Sir Castellan, for me anything will suffice, for my armor is my only wear, my only rest the fray." The host fancied he called him Castellan because he took him for a worthy of Castile, though he was in fact an Andalusian, and one from the strand of Sanlúcar, a crafty a thief as Caucus, and as full of tricks as a student or a page. "In that case," said he, "your bed is on the flinty rock, your sleep to watch alway. And if so, you may dismount and safely reckon upon any quantity of sleeplessness under this roof for a 12-month, not to say for a single night." So saying, he advanced to hold the stirrup for Don Quixote, who got down with great difficulty and exertion, for he had not broken his fast all day, and then charged the host to take great care of his horse, as he was the best bit of flesh that ever ate bread in this world. The landlord eyed him over, but did not find him as good as Don Quixote said, nor even half as good. And putting him up in the stable, he returned to see what might be wanted by his guest, whom the damsels, who had by this time made their peace with him, were now relieving of his armor. They had taken off his breastplate and backpiece, but they neither knew nor saw how to open his gorget or remove his makeshift helmet, for he had fastened it with green ribbons, which, as there was no untying the knots, required to be cut. This, however, he would not by any means consent to, so he remained all the evening with his helmet on, the drollest and oddest figure that can be imagined. And while they were removing his armor, taking the baggages, who were about it for ladies of high degree belonging to the castle, he said to them with great sprightliness, "Oh, never surely was there a knight so served by hand of dame, and as served was he, Don Quixote hight, when from his town he came, with maidens waiting on himself, princesses on his hack. A Rosante for that, ladies mine, is my horse's name, and Don Quixote of La Mancha is my own. For though I had no intention of declaring myself until my achievements in your service and honor had made me known, the necessity of adapting that old ballad of Lancelot to the present occasion has given you to the knowledge of my name altogether prematurely. A time, however, will come for your ladyships to command and me to obey, and then the might of my arm will show my desire to serve you." The girls, who were not used to hearing rhetoric of this sort, had nothing to say in reply. They only asked him if he wanted anything to eat. "I would gladly eat a bit of something," said Don Quixote, "for I feel it would come very seasonably." The day happened to be a Friday, and in the whole inn there was nothing but pieces of the fish they called in Castile abadejo, in Andalusia bacalao, and in some places cutadillo, and in others troutlet. So they asked him if he thought he could eat troutlet, for there was no other fish to give him. "If there be troutlets enough," said Don Quixote, "they will be the same thing as trout, for it is all one to me whether I am given 8 reals in small change or a piece of 8. Moreover, it may be that these troutlets are like veal, which is better than beef, or kid, which is better than goat. But whatever it be, let it come quickly, for the burden and pressure of arms cannot be borne without support to the inside." They laid a table for him at the door of the inn for the sake of the air, and the host brought him a portion of ill-soaked and worse-cooked stockfish, and a piece of bread as black and mouldy as his own armor. But a laughable sight it was to see him eating, for having his helmet on and the beaver up, he could not, with his own hands, put anything into his mouth unless someone else placed it there, and this service one of the ladies rendered him. But to give him anything to drink was impossible, or would have been so, had not the landlord bored a reed, and putting one end in his mouth, poured the wine into him through the other, all which he bore with patience, rather than sever the ribbons of his helmet. While this was going on, there came up to the inn a sowgelder, who as he approached sounded his reed pipe 4 or 5 times, and thereby completely convinced Don Quixote that he was in some famous castle, and that they were regaling him with music, and that the stockfish was trout, the bread the whitest, the wenches ladies, and the landlord the castellan of the castle. And consequently, he held that his enterprise and sally had been to some purpose. But still, it distressed him to think he had not been dubbed a knight, for it was plain to him he could not lawfully engage in any adventure without receiving the order of knighthood. Chapter 3, wherein is related the droll way in which Don Quixote had himself dubbed a knight. Harassed by this reflection, he made haste with his scanty pothouse supper, and having finished it, called the landlord, and shutting himself into the stable with him, fell on his knees before him, saying, "From this spot I rise not, valiant knight, until your courtesy grants me the boon I seek, one that will redound to your praise and the benefit of the human race." The landlord, seeing his guest at his feet, and hearing a speech of this kind, stood staring at him in bewilderment, not knowing what to do or say, and entreating him to rise, but all to no purpose, until he had agreed to grant the boon demanded of him. "I looked for no less, my lord, from your high magnificence," replied Don Quixote, "and I have to tell you that the boon I have asked and your liberality has granted is that you shall dub me knight tomorrow morning, and that tonight I shall watch my arms in the chapel of this your castle. Thus tomorrow, as I have said, will be accomplished what I so much desire, enabling me lawfully to roam through all the four quarters of the world, seeking adventures on behalf of those in distress, as is the duty of chivalry and of knights errant like myself, whose ambition is directed to such deeds." The landlord, who, as has been mentioned, was something of a wag, and had already some suspicion of his guest's want of wits, was quite convinced of it on hearing talk of this kind from him, and to make sport for the night, he determined to fall in with his humor. So he told him he was quite right in pursuing the object he had in view, and that such a motive was natural and becoming in cavaliers as distinguished as he seemed, and his gallant bearing showed him to be, and that he himself in his younger days had followed the same honorable calling, roaming in quest of adventures in various parts of the world, among others the curing grounds of Malaga, the Isles of Riaran, the precinct of Seville, the little market of Segovia, the Olivera of Valencia, the Rondilla of Granada, the Strand of Sanlúcar, the Colt of Cordova, the taverns of Toledo, and divers other quarters, where he had proved the nimbleness of his feet and the lightness of his fingers, doing many wrongs, cheating many widows, ruining maids, and swindling minors, and in short, bringing himself under the notice of almost every tribunal and court of justice in Spain, until at last he had retired to this castle of his, where he was living upon his property and upon that of others, and where he received all knights errant, of whatever rank or condition they might be, all for the great love he bore them, and that they might share their substance with him in return for his benevolence. He told him, moreover, that in this castle of his there was no chapel in which he could watch his armor, as it had been pulled down in order to be rebuilt, but that in case of necessity it might, he knew, be watched anywhere, and he might watch it that night in a courtyard of the castle, and in the morning, God willing, the requisite ceremonies might be performed so as to have dubbed him a knight, and so thoroughly dubbed that nobody could be more so. He asked if he had any money with him, to which Don Quixote replied that he had not a farthing, as in the histories of knights errant he had never read of any of them carrying any. On this point, the landlord told him he was mistaken, for though not recorded in the histories, because in the author's opinion there was no need to mention anything so obvious and necessary as money and clean shirts, it was not to be supposed, therefore, that they did not carry them, and he might regard it as certain and established that all knights errant, about whom there were many so full and impeachable books, carried well-furnished purses in case of emergency, and likewise carried shirts and a little box of ointment to cure the wounds they received. For in those plains and deserts where they engaged in combat and came out wounded, it was not always that there was someone to cure them, unless indeed they had for a friend some sage magician to succor them at once by fetching through the air upon a cloud some damsel or dwarf with a vial of water of such virtue that by tasting one drop of it they were cured of their hurts and wounds in an instant, and left as sound as if they had not received any damage whatever. But in case this should not occur, the knights of old took care to see that their squires were provided with money and other requisites, such as lint and ointments for healing purposes. And when it happened that knights had no squires, which was rarely and seldom the case, they themselves carried everything in cunning saddlebags that were hardly seen on the horse's crop, as if it were something else of more importance, because, unless for some such reason, carrying saddlebags was not very favorably regarded among knights-errant. He therefore advised him, and as his godson so soon to be, he might even command him, never from that time forth to travel without money and the usual requirements, and he would find the advantage of them when he least expected it. Don Quixote promised to follow his advice scrupulously, and it was arranged forthwith that he should watch his armor in a large yard at one side of the inn. So collecting it all together, Don Quixote placed it on a trough that stood by the side of a well, and bracing his buckler on his arm, he grasped his lance and began with a stately air to march up and down in front of the trough. And as he began his march, night began to fall. The landlord told all the people who were in the inn about the craze of his guest, the watching of the armor, and the dubbing ceremony he contemplated. Full of wonder at so strange a form of madness, they flocked to see it from a distance, and observed with what composure he sometimes paced up and down, or sometimes, leaning on his lance, gazed on his armor without taking his eyes off it for ever so long. And as the night closed in with a light from the moon, so brilliant that it might vie with his that lent it, everything the novice knight did was plainly seen by all. Meanwhile, one of the carriers who were in the inn thought fit to water his team, and it was necessary to remove Don Quixote's armor as it lay on the trough. But he, seeing the other approach, hailed him in a loud voice, "O you, whoever you are, rash knight that come to lay hands on the armor of the most valorous errant that ever girt on sword, have a care what you do. Touch it not, unless you would lay down your life as a penalty of your rashness." The carrier gave no heed to these words, and he would have done better to heed them if he had been heedful of his health. But seizing it by the straps, flung the armor some distance from him. Seeing this, Don Quixote raised his eyes to heaven, and fixing his thoughts, apparently upon his lady Dulcinea, exclaimed, "Aid me, lady mine, in this the first encounter that presents itself to this breast which you hold in subjection. Let not your favor and protection fail me in this first jeopardy." And with these words, and others to the same purpose, dropping his buckler, he lifted his lance with both hands, and with it smote such a blow on the carrier's head that he stretched him on the ground, so stunned that had he followed it with a second, there would have been no need of a surgeon to cure him. This done, he picked up his armor and returned to his beat with the same serenity as before. Shortly after this, another, not knowing what had happened, for the carrier still lay senseless, came with the same object of giving water to his mules, and was proceeding to remove the armor in order to clear the trough, when Don Quixote, without uttering a word or imploring aid from anyone, once more dropped his buckler and once more lifted his lance, and without actually breaking the second carrier's head into pieces, made more than 3 of it, for he laid it open in 4. At the noise, all the people of the inn ran to the spot, and among them the landlord. Seeing this, Don Quixote braced his buckler on his arm, and with his hand on his sword exclaimed, "O Lady of Beauty, strength and support of my faint heart, it is time for you to turn the eyes of your greatness on this your captive knight on the brink of so mighty an adventure." By this, he felt himself so inspired that he would not have flinched if all the carriers in the world had assailed him. The comrades of the wounded, perceiving the plight they were in, began from a distance to shower stones on Don Quixote, who screened himself as best he could with his buckler, not daring to quit the trough and leave his armor unprotected. The landlord shouted to them to leave him alone, for he had already told them that he was mad, and as a madman he would not be accountable even if he killed them all. Still louder shouted Don Quixote, calling them knaves and traitors, and the lord of the castle, who allowed knights-errant to be treated in this fashion, a villain and a low-born knight, whom, had he received the order of knighthood, he would call to account for his treachery. "But of you," he cried, "base and vile rabble, I make no account. Fling, strike, come on, do all you can against me. You shall see what the reward of your folly and insolence will be." This he uttered with so much spirit and boldness that he filled his assailants with a terrible fear. And as much for this reason as at the persuasion of the landlord, they left off stoning him, and he allowed them to carry off the wounded, and with the same calmness and composure as before, resumed the watch over his armor. But these freaks of his guest were not much to the liking of the landlord, so he determined to cut matters short and confer upon him at once the unlucky order of knighthood before any further misadventure could occur. So going up to him, he apologized for the rudeness which, without his knowledge, had been offered to him by these low people, who, however, had been well punished for their audacity. As he had already told him, he said there was no chapel in the castle, nor was it needed for what remained to be done. For, as he understood the ceremonial of the order, the whole point of being dubbed a knight lay in the accolade and in the slap on the shoulder, and that could be administered in the middle of a field, and that he had now done all that was needful as to watching the armor, for all requirements were satisfied by a watch of 2 hours only, while he had been more than 4 about it. Don Quixote believed it all, and told him he stood there ready to obey him, and to make an end of it with as much dispatch as possible. For if he were again attacked, and felt himself to be dubbed knight, he would not, he thought, leave a soul alive in the castle, except such as out of respect he might spare at his biting. Thus warned and menaced, the Castilian forthwith brought out a book in which he used to enter the straw and barley he served out to the carriers, and with a lad carrying a candle end, and the 2 damsels already mentioned, he returned to where Don Quixote stood, and bade him kneel down. Then reading from his account book, as if he were repeating some devout prayer, in the middle of his delivery he raised his hand, and gave him a sturdy blow on the neck, and then with his sword a smart slap on the shoulder, all the while muttering between his teeth as if he was saying his prayers. Having done this, he directed one of the ladies to gird on his sword, which she did with great self-possession and gravity, and not a little was required to prevent a burst of laughter at each stage of the ceremony. But what they had already seen of the novice knight's prowess kept their laughter within bounds. On girding him with the sword, the worthy lady said to him, "May God make your worship a very fortunate knight, and grant you success in battle." Don Quixote asked her name in order that he might from that time forward know to whom he was beholden for the favor he had received, as he meant to confer upon her some portion of the honor he acquired by the might of his arm. She answered with great humility that she was called La Tolosa, and that she was the daughter of a cobbler of Toledo, who lived in the stalls of Sancho ben Aya, and that whatever she might be, she would serve and esteem him as her lord. Don Quixote said in reply that she would do him a favor if thenceforward she assumed the Don and called herself Doña Tolosa. She promised she would, and then the other buckled on his spur, and with her followed almost the same conversation as with the Lady of the Sword. He asked her name, and she said it was La Molinera, and that she was the daughter of a respectable miller of Antequera. And of her likewise, Don Quixote requested that she would adopt the Don and call herself Doña Molinera, making offers to her further services and favors. Having thus, with hot haste and speed, brought to a conclusion these never till now seen ceremonies, Don Quixote was on thorns until he saw himself on horseback, sallying forth in quest of adventures. And saddling Rocinante, at once he mounted, and embracing his host, as he returned thanks for his kindness in knighting him, he addressed him in language so extraordinary that it is impossible to convey the idea of it or report it. The landlord, to get him out of the inn, replied with no less rhetoric, though with shorter words, and without calling upon him to pay the reckoning, let him go with a Godspeed.
The end of Part 1. Please continue to Part 2. Published by thoughtaudio.com.
Chapter 4. Of what happened to our knight when he left the inn. Day was dawning when Don Quixote quitted the inn, so happy, so gay, so exhilarated at finding himself now dubbed a knight, that his joy was like to burst his horse girts. However, recalling the advice of his hosts as to the requisites he ought to carry with him, especially that referring to money and shirts, he determined to go home and provide himself with all, and also with a squire. For he reckoned upon securing a farm laborer, a neighbor of his, a poor man with a family, but very well qualified for the office of squire to a knight. With this object, he turned his horse's head towards his village, and Rocinante, thus reminded of his old quarters, stepped out so briskly that he hardly seemed to tread the earth. He had not gone far, when out of a thicket on his right there seemed to come feeble cries as of someone in distress, and the instant he heard them he exclaimed, "Thanks be to heaven for the favor it accords me, that it so soon offers me an opportunity of fulfilling the obligation I have undertaken, and gathering the fruit of my ambition." These cries, no doubt, come from some man or woman in want of help, and needing my aid and protection. And wheeling, he turned Rocinante in the direction whence the cries seemed to proceed. He had gone but a few paces into the wood, when he saw a mare tied to an oak, and tied to another, and stripped from the waist upwards, a youth of about 15 years of age, from whom the cries came. Nor were they without cause, for a lusty farmer was flogging him with a belt, and following up every blow with scoldings and commands, repeating, "Your mouth shut and your eyes open," while the youth made answer, "I won't do it again, master mine. By God's passion, I won't do it again, and I'll take more care of the flock another time." Seeing what was going on, Don Quixote said in an angry voice, "Discourteous knight, it ill becomes you to assail one who cannot defend himself. Mount your steed and take your lance." For there was a lance leaning against the oak to which the mare was tied, "and I will make you know that you are behaving as a coward." The farmer, seeing before him this figure in full armor brandishing a lance over his head, gave himself up for dead, and made answer meekly, "Sir Knight, this youth that I am chastising is my servant, employed to me to watch a flock of sheep that I have hard by, and he is so careless that I lose one every day. And when I punish him for his carelessness and knavery, he says I do it out of niggardliness, to escape paying him the wages I owe him. And before God and on my soul, he lies." "Lies before me, base clown," said Don Quixote. "By the sun that shines on us, I have a mind to run you through with this lance. Pay him at once without another word. If not, by the God that rules us, I will make an end of you and annihilate you on the spot. Release him instantly." The farmer hung his head, and without a word untied his servant, of whom Don Quixote asked how much his master owed him. He replied, 9 months at 7 reals a month. Don Quixote added it up, found it came to 63 reals, and told the farmer to pay it down immediately if he did not want to die for it. The trembling clown replied that as he lived, and by the oath he had sworn, though he had not sworn any, it was not so much, for there were to be taken into account and deducted 3 pairs of shoes he had given him, and a real for 2 bloodlettings when he was sick. "All that is very well," said Don Quixote, "but let the shoes and the bloodlettings stand as a set-off against the blows you have given him without any cause. For if he is spoiled, the leather of the shoes you paid for, you have damaged that of his body. And if the barber took blood from him when he was sick, you have drawn it when he was sound. So on that score, he owes you nothing. The difficulty is, Sir Knight, that I have no money here. Let Andre come home with me, and I will pay him all, real by real." "I go with him," said the youth. "No, God forbid. No, senor, not for the world. For once alone with me, he would ray me like a Saint Bartholomew." "He will do nothing of the kind," said Don Quixote. "I have only to command, and he will obey me. And as he has sworn to me by the order of knighthood which he has received, I leave him free, and I guarantee the payment." "Consider what you are saying, senor," said the youth. "This master of mine is not a knight, nor has he received any order of knighthood, for he is Juan Haldudo the Rich of Quintanar." "That matters little," replied Don Quixote. "There may be Haldudo knights. Moreover, everyone is the son of his works." "That is true," said Andre. "But this master of mine, of what work is he the son, when he refuses me the wages of my sweat and labor?" "I do not refuse, brother Andre," said the farmer. "Be good enough to come along with me, and I swear by all the orders of knighthood there are in the world, to pay you as I have agreed, real by real, and perfumed." "For the perfumery I excuse you," said Don Quixote. "Give it to him in reals, and I shall be satisfied. And see that you do as you have been sworn. If not, by the same oath, I swear to come back and hunt you out and punish you. And I shall find you, though you should lie closer than a lizard. And if you desire to know who it is lays this command upon you, that you be more firmly bound to obey it, know that I am the valorous Don Quixote of La Mancha, the undoer of wrongs and injustices. And so, God be with you, and keep in mind what you have promised and sworn under those penalties that have been already declared to you." So saying, he gave Rosante the spur and was soon out of reach. The farmer followed him with his eyes, and when he saw that he had cleared the wood and was no longer in sight, he turned to his boy Andre and said, "Come here, my son. I want to pay you what I owe you, as that undoer of wrongs has commanded me." "My oath on it," said Andre, "your worship will be well advised to obey the command of that good knight. May he live 1,000 years. For, as he is a valiant and just judge by Roque, if you do not pay me, he will come back and do as he said." "My oath on it too," said the farmer. "But as I have a strong affection for you, I want to add to the debt in order to add to the payment." And seizing him by the arm, he tied him up again and gave him such a flogging that he left him for dead. "Now, Master Andre," said the farmer, "call on your undoer of wrongs. You will find he won't undo that, though I am not sure that I have quite done with you, for I have a good mind to flail you alive." But at last he untied him and gave him leave to go look for his judge in order to put the sentence pronounced into execution. Andre went off rather down in the mouth, swearing he would go to look for the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha and tell him exactly what had happened. and that all would have to be repaid him sevenfold. For all that, he went off weeping, while his master stood laughing. Thus did the valiant Don Quixote right that wrong, and thoroughly satisfied with what had taken place, as he considered he had made a very happy and noble beginning with his knighthood, he took the road towards his village in perfect self-content, saying in a low voice, "Well, may you this day call yourself fortunate above all on earth, O Dulcinea del Toboso, fairest of the fair, since it has fallen to your lot to hold subject and submissive to your full will and pleasure a knight so renowned as is and will be Don Quixote of La Mancha, who, as all the world knows, yesterday received the order of knighthood, and has today righted the greatest wrong and grievance that ever injustice conceived and cruelty perpetuated, who has today plucked the rod from the hand of yonder ruthless oppressor so wantonly lashing that tender child." He now came to a road branching in 4 directions, and immediately he was reminded of those crossroads where knight-errants used to stop to consider which road they should take. In imitation of them, he halted for a while, and after having deeply considered it, he gave Rocinante his head, submitting his own will to that of his hack, who followed out his first intention, which was to make straight for his own stable. After he had gone about 2 miles, Don Quixote perceived a large party of people, who, as afterwards appeared, were some Toledo traders, on their way to buy silk at Murcia. There were 6 of them coming along under their sunshades, with 4 servants mounted, and 3 muleteers on foot. Scarcely had Don Quixote decried them, when the fancy possessed him that this must be some new adventure, and to help him to imitate, as far as he could, those passages he had read of in his books, here seems to come one made on purpose, which he resolved to attempt. So with a lofty bearing and determination, he fixed himself firmly in his stirrups, got his lance ready, brought his buckler before his breast, and planting himself in the middle of the road, stood waiting the approach of these knights errant, for such he now considered and held them to be. And when they had come near enough to see and hear, he exclaimed with a haughty gesture, "All the world stand, unless the world confess that in all the world there is no maiden fairer than the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea del Toboso." The traders halted at the sound of this language and the sight of the strange figure that uttered it, and from both figure and language at once guessed the craze of their owner. They wished, however, to learn quietly what was the object of this confession that was demanded of them, and one of them, who was rather fond of a joke, and was very sharp-witted, said to him, "Sir Knight, we do not know who this good lady is that you speak of. Show her to us, for if she be of such beauty as you suggest, with all our hearts and without any pressure, we will confess the truth that is on our part required of us." "If I were to show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what merit would you have in confessing a truth so manifest? The essential point is that without seeing her, you must believe, confess, affirm, swear, and defend it. Else you have to do with me in battle, ill-conditioned, arrogant rabble that you are. And come you on, one by one, as the order of the knighthood requires, or all together, as is the custom and vile usage of your breed. Here do I bide and await you, relying on the justice of the cause I maintain." "Sir Knight," replied the trader, "I entreat your worship, in the name of this present company of princes, that to save us charging our conscience with the confession of a thing we have never seen or heard of, and one moreover, so much to the prejudice of the Empress and Queens of the Alcaria and Estremadura, your worship will be pleased to show us some portrait of this lady, though it be no bigger than a grain of wheat, for by the thread one gets at the ball, and in this way we shall be satisfied and easy, and you will be content and pleased. No, I believe we are already so far agreed with you, that even though her portrait should show her blind of one eye, and distilling vermilion and sulphur from the other, we would nevertheless, to gratify your worship, say all in her favor that you desire." "She distills nothing of the kind, vile rabble," said Don Quixote, burning with rage. "Nothing of the kind, I say. Only ambergris and Sivean cotton. Nor is she one-eyed or humpbacked, but straighter than a Guandarrama spindle. But you must pay for the blasphemy you have uttered against beauty like that of my lady." And so saying, he charged with level lance against the one who had spoken, with such fury and fierceness that if luck had not contrived that Rocinante should stumble midway and come down, it would have gone hard with the rash traitor. Down went Rocinante, and over went his master, rolling along the ground for some distance. And when he tried to rise, he was unable, so encumbered was he with lance, buckler, spurs, helmet, and the weight of his old armor. And all the while he was struggling to get up, he kept saying, "Fly not, cowards and caitiffs, stay, for not by my fault, but my horses am I stretched here." One of the muleteers in attendance, who could not have had much good nature in him, hearing the poor prostrate man blustering in this style, was unable to refrain from giving him an answer on his ribs. And coming up to him, he seized his lance, and having broken it in pieces, with one of them he began so to belabor our Don Quixote, that notwithstanding, and in spite of his armor, he milled him like a measure of wheat. His masters called out, not to lay so hard, and to leave him alone. But the muleteer's blood was up, and he did not care to drop the game until he had vented the rest of his wrath. And gathering up the remaining fragments of the lance, he finished with a discharge upon the unhappy victim, who all through the storm of sticks that rained on him, never ceased threatening heaven and earth and the brigands, for such they seemed to him. At last the muleteer was tired, and the traders continued their journey, taking with them matter for talk about the poor fellow who had been cudgeled. He, when he found himself alone, made another effort to rise. But if he was unable, when whole and sound, how was he to rise after having been thrashed and well nigh knocked to pieces? And yet he esteemed himself fortunate, as it seemed to him that this was a regular knight-errant's mishap, and entirely, he considered, the fault of his horse. However, battered in body as he was, to rise was beyond his power. Chapter 5, in which the narrative of our knight's mishap is continued. Finding, then, that in fact he could not move, he thought himself of having recourse to his usual remedy, which was to think of some passage in his books, and his craze brought to his mind that about Baldwin and the Marquis of Mantua, when Carloto left him wounded on the mountainside, a story known by heart by children, not forgotten by the young men, and lauded and even believed by the old folk, and for all that, not a whit truer than the miracles of Mohammed. This seemed to him to fit exactly the case in which he found himself. So making a show of severe suffering, he began to roll on the ground, and with feeble breath repeat the very words which the wounded knight of the wood is said to have uttered. "Where are you, lady mine, that you my sorrow do not rue? You cannot know it, lady mine, or else you are untrue." And so he went on with the ballad as far as the lines, "O noble Marquis of Mantua, my uncle and liege lord." As chance would have it, when he had got to this line, there happened to come by a peasant from his own village, a neighbor of his, who had been with a load of wheat to the mill, and he, seeing the man stretched there, came up to him and asked him who he was, and what was the matter with him that he complained so dolefully. Don Quixote was firmly persuaded that this was the Marquis of Mantua, his uncle. So the only answer he made was to go on with his ballad, in which he told the tale of his misfortune and of the loves of the emperor's son and his wife, all exactly as the ballad sings it. The peasant stood amazed at hearing such nonsense, and relieving him of the visor, already battered to pieces by blows, he wiped his face, which was covered with dust. And as soon as he had done so, he recognized him and said, "Señor Quijada," for so he appears to have been called when he was in his senses and had not yet changed from a quiet country gentleman into a knight-errant. "Who has brought your worship to this pass?" But to all questions, the other only went on with his ballad. Seeing this, the man removed, as well as he could, his breastplate and backpiece to see if he had any wound, but he could perceive no blood nor any mark whatever. He then contrived to raise him from the ground, and with no little difficulty hoisted him upon his ass, which seemed to him to be the easiest mount for him, and collecting the arms, even to the splinters of the lance, he tied them on Rocinante, and leading him by the bridle and the ass by the halter, he took the road for the village, very sad to hear what absurd stuff Don Quixote was talking. Nor was Don Quixote less so, for what with blows and bruises, he could not sit upright on the ass, and from time to time he sent up sighs to heaven, so that once more he drove the peasant to ask what ailed him, and it could have been only the devil himself that put into his head tales to match his own adventures. For now, forgetting Baldwin, he besought himself of the More Abindareyes, when the alcaide of Antequera, Rodrigo de Narvaez, took him prisoner and carried him away to his castle. So that when the peasant again asked him how he was and what ailed him, he gave him for reply the same words and phrases that the captive Abidanderes gave to Rodrigo de Narvaez, just as he had read the story in the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, where it is written, applying it to his own case so aptly that the peasant went along cursing his fate that he had to listen to such a lot of nonsense. From which, however, he came to the conclusion that his neighbor was mad, and so made all haste to reach the village to escape the wearisomeness of this harangue of Don Quixote's. With the end of it said, "Señor Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, your worship must know that this fair Zarifa I have mentioned is now the lovely Dulcinea del Toboso, for whom I have done, am doing, and will do the most famous deeds of chivalry that in this world have been seen, are to be seen, or ever shall be seen." To this the peasant answered, "Señor, sinner that I am, cannot your worship see that I am not Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, nor the Marquis of Mantua, but Pedro Alonso, your neighbor, and that your worship is neither Baldwin nor Abidanderes, but the worthy gentleman Señor Quijada?" "I know who I am," replied Don Quixote, "and I know that I may be not only those I have named, but all the 12 peers of France, and even all the 9 worthies, since my achievements surpass all that they have done altogether, and each of them on his own account." With this talk and more of the same kind, they reached the village just as night was beginning to fall. But the peasant waited until it was a little later, that the belabored gentleman might not be seen riding in such a miserable trim. When it was what seemed to him the proper time, he entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, which he found in all confusion. And there was a curate and the village barber, who were great friends of Don Quixote. And his housekeeper was saying to them in a loud voice, "What does your worship think can have befallen my master, Señor Licentiate Pero Perez?" For so the curate was called. "It is 3 days now since anything has been seen of him, or the hack, or the buckler, lance, or armor. Miserable me, I am certain of it, and it is as true as that I was born to die, that these accursed books of chivalry he has, and has got into the way of reading so constantly, have upset his reason. For now I remember having often heard him saying to himself that he would turn knight-errant, and go all over the world in quest of adventures. To the devil and Barabbas with such books that have brought to ruin in this way the finest understanding there was in all La Mancha. The niece said the same and more. You know Master Nicholas, for that was the name of the barber. It was often my uncle's way to stay 2 days and nights together poring over these unholy books at misventure, and after which he would fling the book away and snatch up his sword and fall to slashing the walls. And when he was tired out, he would say he had killed 4 giants like 4 towers, and the sweat that flowed from him when he was weary, he said was the blood of the wounds he had received in battle. And then he would drink a great jug of cold water and become calm and quiet, saying that this water was a most precious potion, which the sage Isquife, a great magician and friend of his, had brought him. And I take all the blame upon myself for never having told your worships of my uncle's vagaries, that you might put a stop to them before things had come to this pass, and burn all these accursed books, for he has a great number, that richly deserve to be burned like heretics. So say I too, said the curate, and by my faith, tomorrow shall not pass without public judgment upon them, and may they be condemned to the flames, lest they lead those that read to behave as my good friend seems to have behaved. At this the peasant heard, and from it he understood at last what was the matter with his neighbor. So he began calling aloud, Open your worships to Senor Baldwin and to Senor the Marquis of Mantua, who comes badly wounded, and to Senor Abiranderes the Moor, whom the valiant Rodrigo de Navarres, the Alcaide of Antequera, brings captive. At these words they all hurried out, and when they recognized their friend, master and uncle, who had not yet dismounted from the ass, because he could not, they ran to embrace him. Hold, said he, for I am badly wounded through my horse's fault. Carry me to bed, and if possible, send for the wise Urganda to cure and to see to my wounds. See there, plague on it, cried the housekeeper at this. Did not my heart tell the truth as to which foot my master went lame of? To bed with your worship at once, and we will contrive to cure you here without fetching that Urgada. A curse, I say once more, and 100 times more, on those books of chivalry that have brought your worship to such a pass. They carried him to bed at once, and after searching for his wounds, could find none, but he said they were all bruises from having a severe fall with his horse Rocinante when in combat with 10 giants, the biggest and the boldest to be found on earth. So, said the curate, are there giants in the dance? By the sign of the cross, I will burn them tomorrow before the day is over. They put a host of questions to Don Quixote, but his only answer to all was give him something to eat and leave him to sleep, for that was what he needed most. They did so, and the curate questioned the peasant at great length as to how he had found Don Quixote. He told him, and the nonsense he had talked when found and on the way home, all which made the licentiate the more eager to do what he did the next day, which was to summon his friend the barber, Master Nicholas, and to go with him to Don Quixote's house. Chapter 6. Of the diverting and important scrutiny which the curate and the barber made in the library of our ingenious gentleman. He was still sleeping, so the curate asked the niece for the keys of the room where the books, the authors of all the mischief were, and right willingly she gave them. They all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 volumes of big books very well bound, and some other small ones. The moment the housekeeper saw them, she turned about and ran out of the room, and came back immediately with a saucer of holy water and a sprinkler, saying, Here, your worship, Senor Licentiate, sprinkle this room. Don't leave any magician of the many there are in these books to bewitch us in revenge for our design of banishing them from the world. The simplicity of the housekeeper made the licentiate laugh, and he directed the barber to give him the books one by one to see what they were about, as there might be some to be found among them that did not deserve the penalty of fire. No, said the niece, there is no reason for showing mercy to any of them. They have, every one of them, done mischief. Better fling them out the window into the court, and make a pile of them and set fire to them. Or else carry them into the yard, and there a bonfire can be made without the smoke giving any annoyance. The housekeeper said the same, so eager were they both for the slaughter of those innocents. But the curate would not agree to it, without first reading at any rate the titles. The first that Master Nicholas put in his hands was the 4 books of Amadis of Gaul. This seems a mysterious thing, said the curate, for, as I have heard say, this was the first book of chivalry printed in Spain, and from this all the others derive their birth and origin. So it seems to me that we ought inexorably to condemn it to the flames as the founder of so vile a sect. No, sir, said the barber. I too have heard say that this is the best of all the books of this kind that have been written, and so, as something singular in its line, it ought to be pardoned. True, said the curate, and for that reason let its life be spared for the present. Let us see that other which is next to it. It is, said the barber, the Sergas de Esplandian, the lawful son of Amadis of Gaul. Then verily, said the curate, the merit of the father must not be put down to the account of the son. Take it, mistress housekeeper. Open the window and fling it into the yard, and lay the foundation of the pile for the bonfire we are to make. The housekeeper obeyed with great satisfaction, and the worthy Esplandian went flying into the yard to await with all patience the fire that was in store for him. Proceed, said the curate. This that comes next, said the barber, is Amadis of Greece, and indeed, I believe all those on this side are of the same Amadis lineage. Then to the yard with the whole of them, said the curate, for to have the burning of Queen Pintiquinestra, and the shepherd Darnel and his eclogues, and the bedeviled and involved discourses of his author, I would burn with them the father who begot me, if he was going about in the guise of a knight-errant. I am of the same mind, said the barber, and so am I, added the niece. In that case, said the housekeeper, here, into the yard with them. They were handed to her, and as there were many of them, she spared herself the staircase and flung them down out of the window. Who was that tub there, said the curate. This, said the barber, is Don Alevente de Lora. The author of that book, said the curate, was the same that wrote The Garden of Flowers. And truly, there is no deciding which of the 2 books is the more truthful, or, to put it better, the less lying. All I can say is, send this one into the yard for a swaggering fool. This that follows is Florismarte of Hircania, said the barber. Senor Florismante here, said the curate. Then by my faith, he must take up his quarters in the yard, in spite of his marvelous birth and visionary adventures, for the stiffness and dryness of his style deserve nothing else. Into the yard with him and the other mistress housekeeper. With all my heart, senor, she said, and executed the order with great delight. This, said the barber, is the Night Platir. An old book that, said the curate, but I find no reason for clemency in it. Send it after the others without appeal, which was done. Another book was opened, and they saw it was entitled The Knight of the Cross. For the sake of the holy name this book has, said the curate, its ignorance might be excused. But then they say, behind the cross there's the devil. To the fire with it. Taking down another book, the barber said, This is the mirror of chivalry. I know his worship, said the curate. That is where Senor Ronaldos of Montalban figures with his friends and comrades, greater thieves than Caucus, and the 12 peers of France with the voracious historian Turpin. However, I am not for condemning them to more than perpetual banishment, because at any rate, they have some share in the invention of the famous Mateo Boiardo, whence too the Christian poet Ludovico Ariosto wove his web, to whom if I find him here, and speaking any language but his own, I shall show no respect whatever. But if he speaks his own tongue, I will put him upon my head." "Well, I have him in Italian," said the barber, "but I do not understand him." "Nor should it be well that you should understand him," said the curate. "And on that score we might have excused the captain if he had not brought him into Spain and turned him into Castilian. He robbed him of a great deal of his natural force, and so do all those who try to turn books written in verse into another language. For with all the pains they take, and all the cleverness they show, they never can reach the level of the originals as they were first produced. In short, I say that this book, and all that may be found treating of those French affairs, should be thrown into or deposited in some dry well, until after more consideration it is settled what is to be done with them, excepting always one Bernardo del Carpio that is going about, and another called Roncesvalles. For these, if they come into my hands, shall pass at once into those of the housekeeper, and from hers into the fire without any reprieve." To all this the barber gave his assent, and looked upon it as right and proper, being persuaded that the curate was so staunch to the faith and loyal to the truth that he would not for the world say anything opposed to them. Opening another book, he saw it was Palmerin de Oliva, and beside it was another called Palmerin of England. Seeing which, the licentiate said, "Let the Oliva be made firewood of at once, and burned until no ashes even are left, and let that Palmerin of England be kept and preserved as a thing that stands alone, and let such another case be made for it, as that which Alexander found among the spoils of Darius, and set aside for the safe keeping of the works of the poet Homer." This book, gossip, is of authority for two reasons. First, because it is very good, and secondly, because it is said to have been written by a wise and witty king of Portugal. All the adventures at the Castle Abiraguarda are excellent and of admirable contrivance, and the language is polished and clear, studying and observing the style befitting the speaker with propriety and judgment. So then, provided it seems good to you, Master Nicholas, I say let this and Amadis of Gaul be remitted the penalty of fire. And as for all the rest, let them perish without further question or query. No, gossip, said the barber, for this that I have here is the famous Don Belianis. Well, said the curate, that and the second, third, and fourth parts all stand in need of a little rhubarb to purge their excessive bile, and they must be cleared of all that stuff about the Castle of Fame and other greater affections, to which end let them be allowed the overseas term, and according as they mend, so shall mercy or justice be meted out to them. And in the meantime, gossip, do keep them in your house, and let no one read them. With all my heart, said the barber, and not caring to tire himself with reading more books of chivalry, he told the housekeeper to take all the big ones and throw them into the yard. It was not said to one dull or deaf, but to one who enjoyed burning them more than weaving the broadest and finest web that could be. And seizing about 8 at a time, she flung them out of the window. In carrying so many together, she let one fall at the feet of the barber, who took it up, curious to know whose it was, and found it said, History of the famous knight Tirante el Blanco. God bless me, said the curate with a shout. Tirante el Blanco, here! Hand it over, gossip, for in it I reckon I have found a treasure of enjoyment and a mine of recreation. Here is Don Crealeson of Montalban, a valiant knight, and his brother Thomas of Montalban, and the knight Fonseca, with the battle the bold Tirante fought with the mastiff, and the witticisms of the damsel, Placer de mi vida, and the loves and wiles of the widow Reposada, and the empress in love with the squire Hippolito. In truth, gossip, by right of its style, it is the best book in the world. Here knights eat and sleep and die in their beds, and make their wills before dying. and a great deal more of which there is nothing in all the other books. Nevertheless, I say he who wrote it, for deliberately composing such fooleries, deserves to be sent to the galleys for life. Take it home with you and read it, and you will see that what I have said is true." "As you will," said the barber, "but what are we to do with these little books that are left?" "These must be not chivalry, but poetry," said the curate. And opening one, he saw it was the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor. And supposing all the others to be of the same sort, "These," he said, "do not deserve to be burned like the others. For they neither do nor can do the mischiefs of the books of chivalry have done, being books of entertainment that can hurt no one." "Ah, senor," said the niece, "your worship had better order these to be burned as well as the others, for it would be no wonder if, after being cured of his chivalry disorder, my uncle, by reading these, took a fancy to turn shepherd and range the woods and fields singing and piping, or what would be still worse, to turn poet, which they say is an uncurable and infectious malady." "The damsel is right," said the curate, "and it will be well to put this stumbling block and temptation out of our friend's way. To begin, then, with the Diana of Montemayor. I am of opinion it should not be burned, but that it should be cleared of all that about the sage Felicia and the magic water, and of almost all the longer pieces of verse. Let it keep, and welcome its prose and the honor of being the first of books of the kind." "This that comes next," said the barber, "is the Diana, entitled the second part, by the Salamancan, and this other has the same title, and its author is Gil Polo." "As for that of the Salamancan," replied the curate, "let it go to swell the number of the condemned in the yard, and let Gil Polo's be preserved, as if it came from Apollo himself. But get on, gossip, and make haste, for it is growing late." "This book," said the barber, opening another, "is the 10 books of the Fortune of Love, written by Antonio de Lofrazo, a Sardinian poet." "By the orders I have received," said the curate, "since Apollo has been Apollo, and the muses have been muses, and poets have been poets, so droll and absurd a book as this has never been written. And in its way, it is the best and the most singular of all this species that have as yet appeared. And he who has not read it may be sure he has never read what is delightful. Give it here, gossip, for I make more account of having found it than if they had given me a cassock of Florence stuff." He put it aside with extreme satisfaction, and the barber went on. "These that come next are the Shepherd of Iberia, Nymphs of Hernaris, and the Enlightenment of Jealousy." "Then all we have to do," said the curate, "is to hand them over to the secular arm of the housekeeper, and ask me not why, or we shall never be done." "This next is the Pastor de Felida." "No pastor that," said the curate, "but a highly polished courtier. Let it be preserved as a precious jewel." "This large one here," said the barber, "is called the Treasury of Various Poems." "If there were not so many of them," said the curate, "they would be more relished. This book must be weeded and cleansed of certain vulgarities, which it has with its excellences. Let it be preserved, because the author is a friend of mine, and out of respect for other more heroic and loftier works that he has written. This," continued the barber, "is the Cancionero of Lopez de Maldonado. The author of that book too," said the curate, "is a great friend of mine, and his verses from his own mouth are the admiration of all who hear them. For such is the sweetness of his voice, that he enchants when he chants them. It gives rather too much of its eclogues, but what is good was never yet plentiful. Let it be kept with those that have been set apart. But what book is that next to it?" "The Galicia of Miguel de Cervantes," said the barber. "That Cervantes has been for many years a great friend of mine, and to my knowledge he has had more experiences in reverses than in verses. His book has some good invention in it. It presents us with something, but brings nothing to a conclusion. We must wait for the second part it promises. Perhaps with amendment, it may succeed in winning the full measure of grace that is now denied it. And in the meantime, do you, Senor Gossip, keep it shut up in your own quarters." "Very good," said the barber. "And here come three together. The Araucana of Don Alonso del Alcila, the Astriada of Juan Rufo, Justice of Cordova, and the Monte Serrate of Cristival de Vures, the Valesian poet. These 3 books," said the curate, "are the best that have been written in Castilian and heroic verse, and they may compare with the most famous of Italy. Let them be preserved as the richest treasures of poetry that Spain possesses." The curate was tired and would not look into any more books, and so he decided that contents uncertified, all the rest should be burned. But just then, the barber held open one called The Tears of Angelica. "I should have shed tears myself," said the curate when he heard the title, "had I ordered that book to be burned. For its author was one of the famous poets of the world, not to say of Spain, and was very happy in the translation of some of Ovid's fables."
We hope you enjoyed this interesting audio title. For more information on all of our titles, please